I'm Adele. I never thought my own blood would betray me like that, not when everything I built was meant to lift us all, not when I trusted them with the one thing I spent years saving for. My dream was simple. I wanted a clinic, a quiet, clean place where people could come and feel safe, where they could heal with dignity, and where I could finally feel like my work meant something more than just punching in and out of hospitals that saw patients like numbers. But I should have known better. Family has a way of hiding knives behind smiles. It all started after my 30th birthday. I had been working double shifts at the hospital, barely sleeping, eating in on-call rooms, and saving every extra penny I could. I cut back on everything I didn't need, and by the end of that second year, I had enough to start planning something real. I still remember the night I told my mother and my older brother. We were sitting around the table after dinner. I was tired but happy. I told them I wanted to open a small private clinic somewhere quiet but not too far from the city. I wanted it to be mine, but I also wanted it to be a family thing. I thought they'd be proud. They were thrilled, or at least they acted like it. My mother smiled with that warm, practiced expression she always wore when she wanted something. My brother nodded and said all the right words. How proud he was, how smart I was, how we could make it even bigger if we worked together. He said he had connections with real estate developers and suppliers, and he could handle the logistics while I handled the medical side. It sounded like a dream. I didn't even notice the first crack. The following weeks blurred into meetings and plans. They found a property faster than I expected, an old but well-maintained building that used to be a dentist's office. I loved it instantly. It had wide windows and a big front entrance, the kind that made you feel welcome. I handed over the deposit without hesitation. My name was on the initial papers. I saw them, I held them. I had no reason to think anything was off. Construction began shortly after, minor renovations, turning old dental offices into exam rooms, upgrading the reception area, painting walls, installing new systems. My mother said she wanted to help with the interior design to make it feel warm and personal. I let them both. I was too focused on the patients I was already imagining in those rooms. I had no idea that while I was building a future, they were digging a hole beneath my feet. 3 months passed, and things started changing. Small things at first. My brother began handling more and more communication with the contractors. He said it was easier that way since I was always at work. Then the bank account I had opened for the clinic began to show unexpected withdrawals. He always had an explanation: supplies, down payments, holding fees. I believed him. He was my brother. I didn't ask enough questions. I was too tired, too hopeful. The first time I felt something was really wrong was when I stopped by the property unannounced. I hadn't been there in over a week. I had been working nights and recovering during the day, but that morning I drove over with coffee and pastries for the workers. When I arrived, the site was empty. No trucks, no tools, no workers. I called my brother. He said they took the day off. I didn't believe him. Not really, but I didn't press it. That night I couldn't sleep. I opened my laptop and started going through the documents again, the bank statements, the property contracts, the renovation receipts. That's when I saw it. The most recent transfer from the clinic account was to a company I didn't recognize, a company owned by my brother. I froze. I read the name again and again, hoping I was wrong, but I wasn't. It was really. Confronted him 2 days later. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse, I just asked questions. He acted surprised, confused, then defensive. He said it was just a temporary transfer to streamline payments. He said I was overworked and paranoid. He even laughed. I left feeling dizzy, not because I believed him, but because I didn't know how to respond. I felt stupid, I felt betrayed, but most of all I felt ashamed for trusting him so completely. After that, everything moved fast. The clinic was suddenly no longer mine. I found out through an email from the city office that the final registration had been completed without my name on it. The documents had changed, the ownership had shifted. I had been removed, my signature forged or replaced. I wasn't even notified. My own dream had been stolen right from under me by my own family. Tried to fight it at first. I contacted a lawyer. He said the case was complicated, the paperwork clean. Unless I had proof of fraud, it would be my word against theirs, and they were smart. They had covered every track. My mother claimed she never knew the money was missing. My brother claimed I had withdrawn from the project on my own. I felt like I was drowning. I stopped going to work, I stopped answering calls, I just sat in my apartment watching the walls breathe. For weeks, I did nothing. My friends asked what was wrong. I told them I was tired, burned out. Maybe I wasn't. All I knew was that the thing I had worked for every day and night for years was now gone, and the people who took it were still smiling, still pretending they loved meth. And one morning, I woke up with a single clear thought: if they could play a game, I could too, and this time I wouldn't be the naive little sister, I would be the doctor who knew how to cut with precision and patience. I started with the bank. I requested every document, every receipt, every transfer since the day we opened the clinic account. I printed them all, spread them across my living room floor, and highlighted every inconsistency, every transfer that made no sense, every payment that didn't match a vendor. Then I looked into my brother's company, the one that had received the biggest payment. It was a shell company registered 6 months before we even started discussing the clinic. It had no website, no employees, no public presence, but it had received thousands from our clinic fund, all marked as consulting or materials. I made a spreadsheet, I made copies, I started building my case, not for court, not yet, but for something else, something more permanent, more personally. Visited the clinic once more, this time during open hours. It was already running, patients were coming and going. The reception desk had a fake smile waiting. The name on the wall was different, not mine. Never mind. I stood there for a few minutes watching the place I built from a distance. Then I turned around and left, not because I was giving up, but because I was just getting started. They thought they won because I stayed silent. They mistook my grief for weakness, but they forgot who I was. I was a surgeon. I knew how to stay steady, how to wait for the right moment, and when that moment came, I would make sure they lost not just the clinic, but everything they thought they stole. The first move was understanding where their pride lived and how to cut straight through it. And I had nothing but time. I never imagined that the first lie I uncovered would lead to so many more. Thought I was just tracing a single betrayal, one act, one moment of weakness, but the deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't a mistake, this wasn't a moment, this was a pattern, a strategy, a long game they had been playing, and I had been the perfect target because I never looked back. I only ever looked forward. The bank records were only the beginning, they were the surface, the paper trail that barely scratched what lay beneath. I had gathered every statement, every transaction from the last 2 years, marked and categorized every suspicious payment, but the numbers alone weren't enough. I needed proof of intent. I needed a motive that could expose them for what they truly were: opportunists, not just family requested property records. Next, the building that was supposed to be ours was legally theirs. I knew that already, but I needed to know how that happened. I found that during the second phase of renovations, there was a title transfer, a change in ownership masked as a restructuring for tax efficiency. It was filed by an attorney I had never heard of, and yet that attorney had notarized documents supposedly signed by my stared at my own forged signature, my name curved in familiar loops, but too perfect to deliberate. I signed messily, always in a rush, and this was clean, like it was drawn from memory, not motion. I printed the document and pinned it to the wall above my desk. It stayed there for days, a silent reminder of how easily I could be erased by people who claimed to love me. Found the name of the notary and visited his office. He was a small man, polite, distant. I introduced myself and said I was reviewing old documents. He pulled the file and showed me the original papers. His logbook said I had been there on a Tuesday at 10 in the morning. I checked my hospital records. I had been in surgery that entire day for 10 hours straight. I had witnesses, patients, a full schedule. I wasn't just absent, I was provably somewhere else. That was the second printout I added to my wall. I began to build a timeline, not of the project, but of the manipulation, the decisions made without me, the documents signed in my name, the money moved, the lies told. Every point on that timeline made me colder, more focused, less angry, more calculating. I started to wonder when it began, not the clinic, but the mindset, the moment when I stopped being their daughter and sister and started being a resource, an opportunity. I looked through old emails, texts, bank logs. I remembered the time I helped pay off our mother's mortgage. I thought it was a gift. Now I saw it as an investment in keeping me close. I remembered my brother's Failed business, how I lent him money without question, how he never repaid it. Now I realized it had taught him that I was easy generous, and Blindy checked his business history. His company had changed names 3 times in 5 years, registered in different states each time, each change just before a financial collapse. I traced the flow of money in and out of those entities, and I found something I wasn't prepared for: my name, my credentials used as leverage in a funding application I had never signed. They had used me as collateral, not just financially, but professionally. Stopped sleeping, ate only when my hands stopped shaking long enough to lift a fork. My apartment was covered in paper-taped timelines, color-coded charts, names, dates, connections, the kind of evidence a prosecutor would build over months. I did it in weeks, not because I was brilliant, but because I had nothing else. I had burned everything else to stay focused. Contacted a forensic document analyst, sent them the signature samples, paid out of pocket without hesitation. The report confirmed what I already knew: my signature had been forged in multiple documents, but it also revealed something else: my mother's signature had been forged too. Or rather altered, stylized. It had the bones of her writing but had been corrected, adjusted, as if someone else had tried to improve it. I realized then that my brother hadn't just used me, he had used her too. I remembered how passive she had been during the whole process, always agreeing with him, always echoing his thoughts, always letting him speak for her. I had assumed she was complicit. Now I saw she might have just been controlled, manipulated, like me, maybe not to the same extent, but enough to silence her, to make her an accessory to her own era. Shuri drove to her house one night, parked across the street, and sat there watching the lights. I didn't go and I didn't call, I just watched her, moving behind curtains, watering plants, watching television, completely unaware that her daughter was sitting outside unraveling a war built within the walls of her own bloodline. I started collecting statements from vendors who worked on the clinic. Some were surprised to hear from me, others were hesitant, but a few remembered clearly how all instructions came from my brother, how payments were made from his accounts, how he told them I was just the investor, not involved in operations. They believed him because he paid and paid on time. They had no reason to question. Each statement became a brick in the case I was building, not a legal case, not yet, but a case of truth, a personal ledger of everything stolen, not just money but agency, voice, identity. They had taken my future and recast it in their image, and now I was erasing that image piece by piece. On afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. A woman's voice asked if I was still interested in purchasing a second property for expansion. I was confused. I never made such an inquiry. But she insisted she had spoken to someone using my name, my email, my title. I asked for the documents she had on file, and she sent them within the hour. They were filled with my information, but none of it came from Method. Was when I realized they were still using me, still pretending I was part of the operation, still signing things in my name, still building on the back of a reputation they stole, and that made everything clear. They hadn't just taken what was mine, they were actively living in my place, walking in my skin, and that meant my silence was not just defeat, it was permission. So I made a new plan. The first phase was already complete. I had evidence, motive, and a timeline. The second phase would be infiltration. I needed to get closer without them knowing. I had to become invisible in plain sight. I updated my resume, discreetly applied for a part-time administrative role under a different name at a medical supply company that worked closely with the clinic. I got the job within a week. My position gave me access to shipping logs, delivery routes, and most importantly, the billing records of every client, including Thiercy, watched from the inside as orders were made and expenses were logged. I learned who they worked with, what they bought, how often they stocked. I saw how much they were making. I saw how well they were doing off the back of what they stole, and I smiled, not with joy but with precision, because every new detail was a nail in their coffin. Never missed a shift. I never arrived late. I became the perfect quiet employee, nodding and smiling and listening. People never noticed the quiet ones, they never suspect the still ones, but I saw everything. I was a ghost in their supply chain, a shadow in their accounts. It was during one of those days that I found the final piece: a discrepancy in a shipment weight versus billing, an extra fee that didn't match the product. It wasn't fraud, But it wasn't opening a crack, and through that crack, I saw everything else: inflated invoices, duplicate orders, fake clients, and then I knew it wasn't just me they had stolen from. They had been scamming the entire system. That changed everything. What had started as a personal betrayal was now a criminal operation. My brother wasn't just greedy, he was corrupt and reckless and arrogant enough to leave a trail, and my mother either didn't know or chose not to see, and I no longer cared. Which, because I had everything I needed and I was no longer the victim, I was the threat. I used to believe the worst thing someone could do was take your money, but money can be replaced. What they took from me was time and faith and identity. What they took was something far more dangerous than currency. They took who I thought I was and replaced it with silence. I didn't see it until I was already deep in the wreckage, until the clinic became just one symptom of a disease that had been growing in my life for years. After uncovering their fraud, I couldn't stop myself from looking further, but it wasn't about the documents anymore. It wasn't about the money or the contracts. I started searching my memories, retracing moments I had buried, things I used to explain away, things I told myself were just family being family, but now every laugh, every comment, every brush off felt loaded with new meaning. Remembered being 12 and winning a school science competition. I had built a simple model of the human heart from recycled materials. The teacher praised me in front of the class and sent a letter home. My mother never mentioned it when I brought it up. She said I should be proud but not arrogant, and that maybe I was lucky more than anything. Talented people don't have to show off, she said. They let others notice without trying. I took that as wisdom now. It sounded like containment. Remembered applying for medical school. I had been accepted into a top program across the country. I was ready to go. I was excited, terrified, and full of possibility. But the night I told them, my mother cried and said she couldn't bear the thought of losing me. My brother told me the city was dangerous and expensive, and that if I stayed local I could help the family more. I told myself they loved me. I stayed. And now I realize they didn't want me to go because distance meant independence, and independence meant I might stop needing them. He remembered years of little decisions, each one shaped by their presence. The apartment I rented had to be close to my mother in case she needed anything. The shifts I chose had to leave room for family dinners. I was always on call, but not just for the hospital, for them too. I thought that was loyalty, but now I knew it was control dressed as tradition. It wasn't just that they had stolen my clinic, it was that they had trained me not to notice until it was too late. They had softened me, molded me, made me mistake obedience for love and sacrifice for gratitude. They made me smaller so they could fill the space I left behind and call it support. He began journaling, not for healing but for clarity. I wrote down every memory that felt different now, every time I had said yes when I wanted to say no, every moment I had made myself smaller to fit their expectations. I had filled notebook after notebook, writing in the margins of my own life until I could see the pattern, not as moments but as a system, and I saw myself not as a daughter but as a tool. It hurt in a way I didn't know how to express. Not like betrayal, not like anger. It was like discovering you had been living in someone else's house, wearing someone else's clothes, and only now seeing your own name scratched out from the mailbox. The grief wasn't for what they took, but for what I never got to become. That grief became fuel, because now I knew that taking back the clinic wasn't enough. They would just find another way to use me, another dream, to step on another smile, to weaponize. I didn't want revenge, I wanted removal. I wanted to become untouchable. So I created a new identity, not legally but emotionally. I started showing up differently at work, quiet but firm, professional but distant. I stopped going to family gatherings, stopped returning casual texts. I started saying no and not explaining why. People noticed, people asked, but I didn't offer anything. I let the silence become my answer. Meanwhile, I kept working from the inside. I continued my part-time job at the supply company where I monitored every transaction connected to the clinic. I watched shipments come and go, inventory rise and fall, invoices get padded, orders get duplicated. I knew what they were doing, and more importantly, I knew how to make it collapse. But I wasn't ready to strike, not yet, because the more I waited, the more they revealed. I discovered that my brother had been applying for private investment, using my medical license as leverage. He pitched himself as the manager of a state-of-the-art clinic run by a renowned physician me, except I wasn't part of it in any real way. He used my image, my name, my reputation, and attached it to his leash. Even had a press article published about the clinic with a quote from me. I never gave. The photo was from an old hospital profile. The quote fabricated and made me feel like a ghost watching a version of myself walk around saying things I never said, working for people I never chose. That article was the turning point. It was public now. It wasn't just between us, it wasn't just family, it was identity theft and professional fraud, and I knew that if I didn't act, they could ruin not just my name, but my license, my career. Everything I had ever built. He printed the article, pinned it on my wall next to the forged signatures and the fake invoices. It wasn't a wall of evidence anymore, it was a battlefield, a reminder that I wasn't imagining it. This was war, and I was done playing nice. I started researching whistleblower protections, fraud reporting structures, legal frameworks, not to go to court but to understand the language of exposure. I didn't want justice, I wanted destruction. I didn't want them to apologize. I wanted them to disappear. Every night, I mapped out possibilities. What happens if I go to the investors? What happens if I go to the press? What happens if I contact the medical board? Each path had consequences, but each one was a knife they had handed me themselves by being careless, greedy, and overconfident. I didn't rush, I stayed quiet, I let them keep talking, keep building. I listened, I documented, I stayed small and invisible while they grew louder and bolder, because the bigger they got, the harder they would fall. Watched my mother on social media posting photos from the clinic with captions like "proud of what we've built," proud of my son and daughter building something together like family. Should I used to flinch when I saw those posts? Now I felt nothing. They weren't lies, they were costumes stitched from half-truths and cheap smalazy. Began to understand that love doesn't always come with sharp teeth. Sometimes it comes with soft voices and long shadows. Sometimes it comes with good intentions tied around your neck like ribbons. And I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. One morning, I took down every piece of paper from the wall. I stacked the notebooks, packed the files, labeled the drives. I stored them all in a locked drawer in a small fireproof safe, not because I was done, but because I was ready. Because now I knew what they had taken from me wasn't just the clinic. They had taken years of my life and called it classiness. They had taken my ambition and called it selfish. They had taken my silence and called it support. But I had found my voice again, and I was going to use it, not in court, no in confrontation, but in the most dangerous way possible, with precision, with Tim and Gand. Without warning, they kept growing louder while I grew more silent. They celebrated louder while I documented in shadows. They smiled wider while I learned the rhythm of their corruption, and I let them rise without resistance, because I knew the higher they climbed, the harder they would fall, and I would be the one to pull the floor from beneath their feet. It was a strange kind of patience, the kind surgeons learn in training. You do not rush into an open wound, you plan every incision, every motion, every thread. And I had become the surgeon of this story, not of bodies, but of consequence. By the time the clinic made it into local magazines, they had become a minor success story, featured on podcasts, invited to health forums, praised for building a modern family-run practice that cared about community. They used the word community a lot. I noticed it was their shield, their performance, and people loved it because everyone wants to believe in good stories even when they are written in fraudy. Had my own kind of spotlight now, buried in invoices, fake accounts, employee testimonies, and shipment data. I had collected so much information that it no longer fit into notebooks. I created digital backups filed under harmless names on encrypted drives, cross-referenced dates and vendor IDs until the patterns became so clear it felt like watching a puzzle assemble itself without touching the pieces. They never saw me coming because I never appeared angry, and anger is what alerts people. They look for it, they expect it, they prepare defenses for it. But I was quiet, calm, helpful, polite, and I said very little in every setting. I was invisible, and from that invisibility I had full access. Knew when they ordered too much inventory for patient numbers that did not match. I knew which employees were being paid off the books, which ones were fired for asking too many questions. I knew that my brother was using two shell companies to cycle money out of the clinic and into personal accounts disguised as medical research. I knew that my mother had filed a trust under her name using profits from the clinic while telling everyone it was reinvested. They had become greedy not just once but always, and greed makes people sloppy. It makes them arrogant, and arrogance is a crack wide enough for anything to slip through, especially Truthone of the delivery drivers who had been working with them since the beginning quit without notice. I found him a week later through a contact in the supply company. He was bitter, unpaid, and angry enough to talk, and what he said confirmed what I had suspected. He told me about backdoor shipments, unsigned invoices, and boxes labeled medical equipment that never made it to the clinic. He said he was told to look the other way and that when he asked questions, they said it was above his pay grade. I asked if he'd be willing to write a statement. He said yes, as long as his name stayed out of the public eye. I agreed. I didn't need heroes, I needed facts, and his facts were gold with every new piece. I wasn't just collecting data, I was building pressure slowly, quietly. I was creating a system they couldn't see, a net forming beneath their performance, one that would tighten. With team, I started leaking small things anonymously. I sent fragments of documents to medical regulatory boards. I sent flagged invoices to financial oversight agencies. I knew they wouldn't act immediately, but they would begin watching, and once those eyes turned toward the clinic, every lie they had ever told would become fluorescent. Still, they kept smiling. My mother started giving small talks at local universities about women and healthcare leadership. My brother was nominated for a minor award in entrepreneurial innovation. I watched them pose for photos, shaking hands, receiving applause, wearing clothes I recognized from years ago when we still sat at the same table, pretending we were something close to honesty. Didn't feel rage anymore. I felt distance. They had become characters in a play I no longer believed in, and I was the stagehand who had started to pull out the nails beneath their set. When they applied for a government partnership grant, I intercepted the proposal through one of the reviewers I knew from the hospital network. They were trying to secure federal funding using altered statistics and ghost patients. I sent a quiet message pointing out the inconsistencies, not from my account but from a fabricated internal audit address that looked like an employee with concerns I knew they would investigate, and they did. The application was denied without explanation. I watched as my brother posted online about bureaucratic incompetence, how small practices were always overlooked, how unfair the system was. The irony almost made me laugh. He had started the fall, but it wasn't enough. I wanted the impact to break everything, not just their business but their sense of control. So I went for the core. I filed a confidential complaint with the state medical board about the misuse of my license. I submitted proof of forged documents, fabricated patient report statements from vendors, a full report detailing how my identity had been used to secure investments. Without my knowledge, I wasn't sure what would happen at first. They replied with the standard message of receipt and review, then silence for weeks. But silence was good. Silence meant someone was reading and verifying and preparing. I used that time to prepare too. I printed everything I had, sorted it into files labeled Truth, Fraud, Betrayal, Family, and finally Closure. I placed the files into a single binder and locked it in my safe, not because I was hiding it but because I knew its time was coming. Soon afternoon, I visited the clinic again for the first time in months. This time, I didn't walk past or stare from across the street. I went and I sat in the waiting area. No one recognized me. The receptionist smiled and handed me a clipboard. I filled it out with a fake name, fake symptoms, fake insurance information, and what Teddy wanted to see it one last time before it changed, before everything they built on my back collapsed under its own weight. I looked around. The clean walls, the cheerful photos, the motivational posters about care and integrity and community. It felt like a mockery, a stage, and I was its final audience. When they called my fake name, I stood up and walked out, not because I was scared, but because I didn't need to play that part anymore. I had already written the final act. The next week, the medical board contacted me again. They had begun a formal investigation. They thanked me for my detailed documentation and said they would be conducting interviews and audits. I asked them to keep my name out of it as long as possible. They agreed. The walls were closing in and none of them saw it coming. That night, I slept for the first time in what felt like years, not because it was over, But because it had truly begun, the fall was no longer an idea, it was emotion, and it was beautifully no longer needed revenge. I had something better, a plan, and Patty unseen every truth they ever tried to bury. They thought they were untouchable, invincible, like kings in a castle built on lies and stolen dreams, but I was the storm waiting patiently behind the calm facade. I had spent months gathering every piece, every secret, every fracture, and now the weight of truth was crushing them slowly, mercilessly, and I was the silent architect of their downfall. The first cracks appeared in the form of whispered rumors from suppliers caught in the web of inflated invoices and missing deliveries. A delivery driver spilled more than he intended. A vendor called my lawyer concerned about unusual payment requests. The medical board sent letters requesting urgent clarifications and documentation. The clinic's reputation began to tarnish. He watched my brother's confident smile falter during meetings. He was defensive and aggressive, but it was clear he was unraveling. My mother tried to maintain appearances, posting carefully crafted social media messages about family unity and dedication to patient care. But behind the scenes, she was retreating, withdrawing from calls, avoiding my lawyer's inquiries. Their employees started talking behind closed doors. Whispers of audits, investigations, and possible legal action spread anxiety among the staff. Some were loyal, others began looking for new jobs. I knew their network was collapsing and the foundation was weak. He continued to add fuel to the fire, sending anonymous tips to regulatory bodies and journalists interested in corruption and healthcare. I was careful, meticulous. I never left a trace. I let the system work through the evidence I provided and watched as it dismantled the empire built on my back. There was a moment when my mother called me, her voice trembling, asking to meet. I refused. I wasn't interested in reconciliation, I was interested in resolution, and my resolution was not forgiveness but accountability. The clinic was eventually closed pending investigation. The public statements from authorities cited serious breaches of trust, financial improprieties, and professional misconduct. The local community was shocked and divided. Some stood by the family name, others saw the truth. They could no longer ignore me. Brother faced charges of fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. My mother was questioned about her role in managing the clinic's finances and oversight. The process was slow, painful, but it was justice, and it was. Manet stood outside the closed clinic one evening, watching the lights go out, the signs taken down, the silence settling like dust, and I felt no triumph, only relief that the nightmare was finally over and that I had taken back what was mine, not through violence or anger but through patience, strategy, and truth. He wasn't the same person who had walked into that first meeting years ago. I was stronger, wiser, and more cautious, but I was whole again, and that was enough. Lesson I learned was clear: trust is precious, but self-trust is invincible, and I had reclaimed mine. The weight of years lifted slowly, like fog retreating from a quiet morning. The clinic was gone, but so was the shadow it cast over me. I walked through the empty rooms in my mind, the spaces I had once dreamed into existence, now reclaimed by silence. And I realized that the real victory was not in buildings or contracts, but in reclaiming myself. I spent long nights reflecting on what I had lost and what I had gained. The anger that once burned like wildfire had cooled into a steady flame, a flame that reminded me who I was, who I always had been beneath the layers of betrayal and pain. A doctor, a woman, a survivor. Legal battles were exhausting, draining, but they were necessary. The truth unfolded piece by piece in court documents, testimonies, and evidence carefully presented by my lawyer and collected by me. The days blurred, but each moment brought me closer to a sense of justice, not revenge, but justice. Me family fractured beyond repair. The bonds that once held us together snapped under the weight of lies, greed, and deceit. I mourned the loss of what could have been the family I wished for, but I refused to mourn my own worth or future. Friends who had stood by me became my new family, those who listened, believed, and supported without judgment. They were my anchors in the storm, reminding me daily that I was more than what they had tried to take from. My return to medicine, not in a clinic I once dreamed of, but in smaller spaces where I could make a difference, where every patient's story mattered, and where my healing was not just physical but emotional too. He started mentoring young doctors, especially women, encouraging them to trust themselves, to fight for their dreams, and to never let anyone diminish their light. I shared My story, quietly hoping it would inspire not pity. Sometimes late at night, would catch myself smiling at memories not of betrayal but of resilience, moments when I chose strength over despair, when I built bridges instead of walls. Learned that closure is not an event but a process, a journey that requires patience, compassion, and above all forgiveness, not necessarily for them but for myself, for the freedom to move forward unburdened. And in that freedom I found peace, a peace that no amount of stolen money or broken trust could ever take away. Was no longer the victim of their greed. I was the author of my own story, the keeper of my own future, and that was everything. Thanks for listening to my story with me, and don't forget to subscribe and follow for more stories.